Why should you, or why should I, why should anyone read great books, read the classics in every sense? It's a question there are plenty of people out there will answer for you, but I just want to offer one approach, and I'll make a few more videos on the same topic to do with great books and classical learning and humane learning, things like that. And I want to start with the kind of asking the question, what are great books and what's the kind of cultural background to that, analyse that, and then offer some reasons why I think it's good to read the great books. I mean, the Iliad, or how about you want the Tale of Sinui and other ancient Egyptian poems, or Gilgamesh is an obvious one, or Dostoevsky, who I think I've got knocking around somewhere here, Dostoevsky again, or Shakespeare. Why should you read these authors? Beyond just, well, I fancy it, or it's interesting, that, there's a very good reasons to read things. Now, what I'm going to argue is unabashedly, in relation to a Western-centric idea of great books, a Western canon of great books, canonicity is presumed here at some level. That doesn't mean that what I say couldn't be potentially applied to other canons. It absolutely could, I think. I mean, you imagine the great Chinese literature of the poets of the Tang era through to the Yuan playwrights, I'm sure, and dozens of other important authors going back as far as the classical sages all the way forward. I'm sure, people with greater expertise on that could talk about that, and of course that is an important thing in terms of the idea of the classics of Chinese literature, your Journey to the West and your Water Margin. So I can't speak to those things. I'm not an expert on those, and I'm not really an expert even on my own canon. It's a learning process, it's a journey. But there's a way in which we recognise these are books that have been important. And I'll talk a bit about why I think they might be important. But, we recognise, these books are both good in the sense they are intelligent, or they are funny or entertaining, and also they have been significant. They have been something which has helped shape other things. That's the kind of basic idea that I think we think of what's in the canon is what's recognised as both good and important generally. So the question is, why should you bother reading these? And as I say, they might be almost the best reasons why it seems like a fun idea, or I quite like the look of that book. But just we want to drill down because it's a disputed question, because it brings a whole kind of mindset question into view of, what does the past matter? Is the past any more important now? Is Rupi Kaur pretty much the same as Shakespeare in terms of cultural significance? Setting aside any questions of quality, is it just every poet is the same? And in fact, writers now, may be more important because they are able to speak more to our present concerns. There's a issue of we're in the present crisis, and so we need people who can speak to that. Though every generation must have its prophets, I would generally say no. I think there is a lot to gain now by the study of what has already been said then. The tested group wisdom of thousands of years of selection. And you can get into who selected this, or how did this happen? But eventually, there is no conspiracy. We should dismiss the outlier. Of course, there's some fairness to the question of who selects what gets read, but there's no seriousness to the idea of is Shakespeare more important, a better playwright or author than lots of other authors? Shakespeare is so supreme that in a medium which is so dictated by language, Shakespeare goes around the world and is recognised as important, despite the fact that he is awkwardly English. That is how supreme he is. It's such a universal matter of recognition then and now by all manner of people, high and low, and his audiences were very much high and low at the time, and he was comfortably, the master playwright of the era. There's just no serious debate about that. So though there are serious questions about how we select all these things, and there's always a degree of subjectivity to any individual selection, generally speaking, we're talking about the tried and tested, and some of that is by accident. We don't have every author from the past, but some of it is also by recognition, at the time. And I think Aristotle's Poetics, his key examples for tragedies, he does mention many playwrights, but the most important examples he offers are of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and those are the three tragic playwrights who have survived through the ages. Now, it wasn't Aristotle burnt all the rest of the books. Aristotle has them. Everyone has access to the kind of printed, to the written copies. Everyone in his circles, at least, do. And nonetheless, the three most important playwrights to him are those which have so many copies done and are so popular and desired that they survive. There will be important writers we've basically lost, absolutely, and important works we certainly have lost, tragically. But generally speaking, this kind of sifting, though it has imperfections, and though you can always dispute a particular thing or whether or not there is particular power interests at play, has shaken out to produce an incredibly high quality canon. So both for quality and for importance, we're looking at that set and of things that have influenced Western culture, civilization. And that doesn't just mean things by British people, as I mentioned, Greek authors, Latin authors, but not just by Greek and Latin authors, not just by Southern Europeans, but also by Middle Easterners, most obviously the influence that we have from the Hebrew Bible and from Jewish writers of the New Testament, but and their successors, and also the Sumerian culture, which influences lots of things that kind of float west as well, in that cultural interchange that's happening. The influence of Egyptian culture is significant to say to Herodotus, who loves it. Herodotus, the first great historian, a Greek, heavily influenced by Egyptian culture. And we see that also in terms of the influence on Alexander the Great and on all his successors, in fact, but particularly on his Ptolemaic pharaoh successors who built the Library of Alexandria, and who really, the idea of mass copying of work to create, preserved canon, indeed, happens partly, that's a great originating place for that. Egyptian culture is very significant there. Both Sumeria and Egypt are very early written cultures, and the ones in which Europe and more broadly Western culture is most influenced. But also you have the northern influence. You have your Saxons and your Norse, your Poetic Edda and your Beowulf, and you see that mixing pot in of cultural influences in Dark Age Britain. Very violent and unpleasant, but nonetheless you see all these things come together to create a distinctive language and a tongue which becomes arguably the dominant one. It is, in many ways culturally now the dominant one, but I'm just talking in terms of the various influences that eventually end up there become a dominant culture worldwide through the two succeeding empires. So there's all these things that go into selection, there's all these influences, and so there must be recognition of all these when we talk about great books, and we have to recognise that other cultures have other great books, and I've talked about the Chinese canon as a very obvious example of that. There is a degree to which naturally we must privilege written work over unwritten work, and I'm not trying to be utterly frivolous by saying that, because it may seem self-evident, but because someone might say, well, some cultures have very strong, sort of spoken cultures, oral cultures, and that's true, and there may be really wonderful things in those cultures. Someone might say, well, this is a wonderful thing, and of course we have a very obvious preserved example of such a one, of such an oral culture in the Iliad. The Iliad is probably, almost certainly in the form we have it, the final recension by an author or authors, lots of different things go, debates about any of these texts, but it is a preserved oral story that has been preserved over generations for hundreds of years, and we have very good reason to think it has lasted in some elements of it for up to 500 years. We have evidence that oral cultures do preserve their stories very well. Written cultures do too, but via a different medium, of course. And so, we have some of that in Western culture, but broadly speaking, we're talking about the big tides and the big works, and there may be a very significant subcultural work that is chiefly oral, but it's not going to find an easy place in that big influential canon stretching over 3,000 years, because of the fact that it cannot have had reach beyond that place. Where it becomes more broadly significant, it is because we've used that cultural technology of writing to spread it. The Poetic Edda or the Iliad being obvious examples. So that is kind of what is the question? What are great books? How do we select them? What are some of the controversies involved? Now, I want to give, let's say, 3 reasons. One is really a set of reasons, but 3 reasons why we should study the great books, why we should read them and discuss them with people. There are other reasons available. You may go and find them. Let's say there are some minor reasons. This is reason number 1, but it's the minor reasons. The pleasure of knowing a reference, or the background to an adaptation. I think of something that strikes me, the Friends episode where Joey gets Encyclopedia Volume V. Is it from one of Penn and Teller? I feel like it's from someone like that. I think it's from, as I think it is from Penn and Teller. He buys V, and he's suddenly able, because he's not in the early seasons of Friends moron, he's just not educated. So he's like, oh wow, I can talk about Vietnam, and so they have a good conversation about Vietnam, and then they move immediately on to the Korean War, because there's a documentary, and of course Joey knows nothing about this. But the idea that it's pleasurable to understand things, to be able to engage in conversation, to be able to say, oh yes, actually, yeah, no, I remember that, that's a good point. Or, oh, much like we say, oh, I've been to that place, yes. It's just a pleasure, isn't it, sometimes to be able to know and to be able to connect on knowing shared experiences, shared references. And of course, what is meme culture but jokes based on a vast reservoir of shared culture, but isolated to a particular written medium, i.e. the internet. You also might enjoy the wider historical trivia knowledge. This is kind of related, and it certainly applies to our Joey example. But you get the point that it might be that you're like, I would just like to know a bit about more about history. I like the idea of knowing about history, and I guess if I read these major works and the historians and also the poets might be relevant to knowing about what these cultures were like, just seeing it as an object of study there. Do you know what I mean? Like it's a kind of it's fun to know. So both fun to have the shared references and fun perhaps to develop a knowledge, a bit like someone might, any culture really. You might say, well, I want to know about Mansa Musa and the Empire of Mali. Or you might say, oh, I'd really love to know about the pre-Columbian peoples of North America. These, you might be like, what wonderful cultures to learn about. And it's the same. And here, because written work is such an important part of it, of course, you're going to look at the writing. I'd say those and similar reasons are, similarly a minor and potentially negative reason is because you're being forced to. Though often things we're forced to do are good for us, eat our vegetables, for instance. But the point is there are a lot of minor reasons which are understandable. If you like, we've got meta reason 1, you'd just quite like to read these books, that's the best reason of all. Minor reasons, often to do with it might be pleasurable to have a shared reference or to understand something or to pick up some historical point. Those sort of things which are good reasons, of course, in the sense I think the ones I've mentioned are legitimate desires, but which could be applied to all kinds of areas of life, and certainly, dwelling in the meme mimes and learning the history of the meme people would surely be as relevant as understanding the idea of nightingales in the wood from Agamemnon, and the general story of Agamemnon being killed by Clytemnestra. That would surely be probably more relevant, in fact, though of course the best thing is to combine the two, because if you get those sweet classical references you can make them into new memes. So yeah, you get the idea. Like, those are minor reasons. I want to give 2 major reasons as well, things that I think are important, and it doesn't mean that everyone thinks they're important, but I think they flow from the nature of what a canon is and what these books are. The first is that it's a cultural inheritance, that it's a way of knowing our cultural genetics, or part of our cultural genetics. Certainly you should go and look at the Book of Laws, and the Book of Laws, of course, is itself a book, and the Book of Buildings, the Book of Architecture. Lord Clark, quoting Ruskin, is quite keen on the idea that we learn a great deal about a culture and civilization from the works of their hands, from the buildings and the paintings and the artifacts. Look at the difference between the Hôtel Dieu in the old Duchy of Burgundy and the Greenwich Naval Hospital, these wonderful hospitals for often the poor, versus a hospital that has been put up last week or something. What do they say about culture, for good and for bad? So yes, certainly great books is not the whole of the story. Certainly watch Lord Clark's Civilization for more on that one. But the point is, it is a significant part of knowing where we've come from, what has happened before, and you learn bad and disturbing things. Great books should not be in that sense sanitized. They shouldn't be a sort of, well, here are the 10 books which tell us why everything is hunky-dory and wonderful. They're things that are going to sometimes confront and challenge us. Well, they are hopefully all going to confront and challenge us in different ways. Partly these things from our shared past will confront us in ways that disturb our preconceptions of ourselves and of our time, but also there will be things that we think, wow, that's tough. I don't know how, like reading family history that is upsetting. So of course there'll be things like that, but I think basically whether or not the history is positive or negative, the great books are the highest works of, the highest written works of the people you've come from. George Orwell, says someone might say, well, how is England now anything like England 100 years ago? Or Spain now, like Spain 100 years ago. Well, it's a bit like why are you the same person you were 30 years ago? Well, you just are, aren't you? The cells may have changed, but ultimately the body is the same. There is some sense of identity through all kinds of factors, geography and language and so on, that determine a kind of the culture, and the idea that culture is often fairly steady. There are lots of consistent elements in any given culture over time, as well as many plastic ones. And the point is, these books are one of the most easiest records, without you becoming either a professional historian who studies rolls and censuses, or an archaeologist spending all their time on inscriptions. These might be extra useful things, but rather than becoming a professional or whatever, you instead say, well, I just read these great books and they'll give me some sense of what's going on, often for good and for bad. So you get the idea that even though we are very different now to what we were 100 years ago and 100 years before that, and so on and so forth, those of us who are from the West, and the same principle applies to anyone from any culture, I think, can learn more about our subculture, English, French, whatever, and our metaculture, this broad, somewhat related set of cultures we call Western civilization. Somewhere from the upper end of the Danube west to the Pacific coast of America. That civilization is able to be discussed and understood genetically, partly through representative works. And that's not simply a matter of trivia. This is the point. It may seem like I'm saying, yes, so you should just learn this random trivia. But I think there is and it's not simply the Santayana point about knowing history so you're not doomed to repeat it or something. But it's rather more than that. There is a degree of that, but then actually learning from history is very difficult. But it's a sense of self-knowledge, that there is a way in which we need to look into our family history. Both, yes, you learn something about yourself through your family, and knowing that your ability, your perfect pitch, your great aunt actually had that. Oh, that's wonderful, isn't it? That's an interesting piece of news. That's not a great moment of self-recognition, but it's a moment of connection. But the fact that we see ourselves perhaps even more convincingly in terms of self-recognition, not in our own family, though sometimes we might understand personality and habits come from our dad, or the way in which we deal with certain situations seems like this other person. But more great self-recognition comes from looking in the mirror of a broader sample than the immediate family. And again, as I say, the great books are a way of doing that, and they are a convincing and well-selected and often beautiful way of doing that. They're a way of understanding the ways that, so for instance, and this reaches to very meta levels, and I'm not, this is not what we should all be aiming for, absolutely. But let's say we think, why is there this enormous crisis chiefly in Western discourse, let's say, and by that I mean particularly in English and Anglophone countries, but also in most of Europe. Why is there this great crisis related to the idea of the mind and the body and the connection between those two, and an ongoing crisis. And I think you can imagine someone saying, "Oh well, I guess it's just because we don't believe in all that religious stuff anymore." But of course, it's much more complicated than that. And the most obvious thing to me seems, well, a key figure in that is René Descartes, whose most famous saying, "Cogito ergo sum," is in fact a proof for the existence of God. So it can't be about the fact that we're all simply disenchanted from religion and so don't believe in this gobbledygook. It must be something more complicated. So this great cultural crisis, which is plainly, because it's so much about who we are. I'm not talking about any given solution to that, but it's about who we are, and causes so many debates between people of organised religion, of kind of more informal spirituality, of atheist leanings, and so on. All these people have very strong views about how culture should be directed or run based on religion of one kind or the other of those three. But the point is that actually so much of this goes back to debates happening before, during and after the period of Descartes, and issues of Cartesian duality is itself an attempt to respond to what is a crisis then of thinking about the body and the mind and the soul, indeed, if we add that one in as well. And so yes, you get the idea that these that's a really meta big example, but you can also say why is the idea of the hero in Western culture, and I mean even literally the cowboy Western, why is it like it is compared to other cultures? And you've got to look at Achilles, and you've got to look at the Ring saga, things like that. By that I mean the Volsungs, and all that kind of Germanic and indeed Norse stuff, the Nordic and Germanic hero. These ideas of the hero which are not identical in every culture at every point, even if there are some shared, more or less universal features of heroism. So and then anyone who wants to say how do we deal with questions of whether innate or cultural masculinity, femininity, and so on. In the West, you've got to grapple with where some of the language we use comes from David and Goliath, and from Gilgamesh, and from Achilles, and from Roland, and whatever else. All these figures. We're going to talk about that. It gives us a wider context for who we are now. So that's reason number one: cultural inheritance, and cultural piety. Perhaps I'd add on as a sub reason just the fact that I will offer the most controversial statement on my channel so far. Over 3 years or whatever it is, that ultimately it is good to love and honour our parents and our grandparents and our many times great grandparents, knowing all their flaws and accepting that they are by no means perfect and may have done and been involved in bad things. But there's a way in which we connect and know these cultures not just as an object, but as things shared that we are, and that means we love them. And I think this is it's a Lewis point, the idea that we learn to love other people's mothers in a positive way through loving our own first. We understand why it's important, and so knowing and loving your own culture in that sense through that cultural inheritance shouldn't render us insular and bigoted, but should make us more respectful for the fact that other people love their cultures. Major reason number two, my second big reason, is that there is an issue of, and this connects to the first, but I think is slightly distinct, it's about the idea of, let's call it humane letters, the idea that there is an expansion of the mind and a rounding of the mind and a rounding of the spirit through engaging with this great chorus, the great democracy of the dead, Chesterton called it, the many opinions under the tree, the fact that everyone comes to the tree and everyone gives their opinions. And yes, you can talk about your issues of selectivity and you need to make sure to listen to the different voices. But you just read Plato and Aristotle and you've got some different voices there. You've got one guy who wants a quasi-communist, quasi-fascist dictatorship led by scientists. And the other guy's like, look, politics is very messy and complicated. Let's have some capital R realistic, ironically, because that's a debated term. Hey, set that aside for a different day. But in IR terms, a realistic view of politics and of foreign policy. Plato and Aristotle, even within 2 generations of a very closely related set of cultural movements, have vastly different perspectives on how politics works and how it should work. Let alone when you add in all the other people you could imagine putting in into the great debates over 3,000 years and more, when you introduce your Egyptian and Sumerian authors, who are some of the forebears, and you have your skepticism of centralized or authority in the king, in a kind of very powerful king in the Hebrew world, in the Hebrew Bible, as represented in the Hebrew Bible, and the great skepticism of that kind of divinely anointed king, maybe necessary, but also a cause of great evils. You've got all these government theories coming in, and again, this is not an issue of being an object of anything. Oh, well, it's very interesting to know ancient ideas of government, but that you become part of a debate, and you become a living link in that, and your mind changes as a result. You lose a perspective that is distant from other people, and distant from that most foreign of all countries, the past, and your mind loses our natural parochialism, where we we love the place we're in and we value the place we're in. I've actually already said there's a great deal of value in that, I think. But I think that can become a thing which isolates us in history. We can say, and can therefore, particularly, and this is the point here, isolate our mind. And our mind is a bit like a plant growing without all the right nutrients. It doesn't have enough sun, so it's a bit pale. It doesn't have enough nutrients in the sort of same kind of, the leaves are odd. It kind of has an odd trunk. It maybe can't grow in all the right directions, so it grows in a funny direction. Our mind, when not engaged in conversation that goes beyond the most perfervid kind of arguments of our day, when it's fully engaged in that cycle, I think it is that is essentially destructive to us. And instead, sometimes becoming lost in this great stream allows just the edges to be rubbed off. Use that metaphor, that we, rather than us being a plant that's grown wrong, let's say we're a kind of jaggedy rock, and when we're being smashed against everything now, we become more shardy. But when we're thrown into the great stream of time, we're knocked around, but that becomes a smoothing action. And so not just is there this kind of self-recognition and a connection to the past in what may almost seem a spiritual sense, but there's also this intellectual thing going on, right? Where we are humbled in relation to the great triumphs and the great failures of human knowledge and success. There is nothing more likely to make us skeptical of modern perfection in terms of, isn't this the best time ever, than looking at the fact that many people have thought that in the past, and also that history and art and letters, we have not bettered Gilgamesh and the Iliad. We've not suddenly been like, oh well, when you read a certain kind of bro on Twitter saying books are useless now, or you shouldn't waste your time on that, or if only all books I saw this could be summarised in 5 paragraphs. This is just the ramblings of the demented sharp rock smashed around in the modern world, who believes that we have somehow got greater human insight than Shakespeare did. This is something which I almost, there's no ability to defend on a short time scale. Now I can hardly demonstrate to you, other than to say, you read Shakespeare and you see that he has understood the human heart, and probably as an individual person, more greatly and more deeply than anyone ever has. And that's a vast work, it's a vast set of his works, and he explores all its aspects in different places, and he begins to draw conclusions. You think about his idea, and what his ideas of kingship are actually, I suspect, ill understood. But the idea of that there is a right kingship and a wrong kingship, and there is an inner kingship that's distinct from the power. And this is something you see through the ways what character forms. This kind of very detailed theory that spreads across so many of his plays, and also to do with the redeeming power of love, very significant in Shakespeare, again, maybe in a way that's not always appreciated. You look elsewhere and you think, has there ever been better love poetry than the Song of Solomon? meme jokes aside has there? No, probably not. And not that there isn't good stuff more recently. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying we are put into historical perspective and humbled and awed. And we see the follies of human arrogance. Many people before have thought they finally got to the culture that's going to solve everything, and they never have. So there is a way in which we are humbled, and a way in which we are encouraged, and a way in which we find more beauty and insight. And this changes our mind. It's not just the spiritual thing, but it's also the intellectual thing, where we become better. This is, in Aristotle's terms, I guess I'm thinking, we basically become a more complete person, and we become more able, both these major factors make us a complete person, more able to interact with the world, and to serve our fellow man, and to contribute. In a sense, most of us don't have very much to contribute. None of us are going to write a classic that's going to be in the canon in 1,000 years. But we have, in our own small way, the ability, via a self-recognition and an expression of that self-recognition, in thought and word and deed, and in care for our neighbour, through this process. And yes, this all sounds very highfalutin, but that's good. Humans are wonderfully precious, dignified, able creatures. And one of the many things, and eating grandma's apple pie is another, and playing softball in, as I did with my kids fairly recently, in 50 Fahrenheit degree weather. Those are other ways. But great books are a significant way of rendering us better able, more complete people who are able to bless the world we live in. I think it is that great a purpose and contribution that great books have to make. So I'll talk more I'll make some more videos on this about different areas of the classics, and some sub videos. Should we bother learning classical languages? Latin and Greek are the most obvious ones. Should we bother with that? Generally just talking about aspects of the question, and trying to sum up some of the categories of books we could talk about to do with great books. But this is just a general, why should we read the great books? I'd love to know what you think, what your favourite great books and classics are. As I say, that goes from that goes from Homer and Gilgamesh all the way through to Dostoevsky and whatever else. Whoever in that range, what are your favourite classics and great books? What are your reasons for reading or not reading the great books? Whatever that is, I think it's a valid contribution to the discussion to add, and I can certainly disagree with what I've said. But yeah, please do add those comments in the comments, and I'll see you next time.